So I'm going to cover F3 and G3 in the Nimzo Indian this time. So D4, knight F6, C4, E6, knight C3, bishop B4, F3. And now one of the main moves is D5, but I prefer to just let white build his center if he wants to with castle. So castle, and the two main moves here are E4 and A3. And my analysis on E4 is very short. But anyways, okay, so E4 and D5. And I believe that the lines should usually transpose. For example, if E5, one line is knight FD7, which I think is doing just fine for black. But the line I'm suggesting is with knight H5. And there's an immediate threat of playing queen H4 check. So bishop E3 and now C5. And usually he'll play C takes D5, E takes D5, so it should transpose. So I'm just going to go back. So E4, D5, C takes D5, E takes D5, E5, and now you play knight H5. So you have the same threat. And the thing is, he can't really exploit anything here. The problem is, let's say you play... If you play knight e2, then you immediately just play f6 and strike back at the center. So it's extremely, it can be extremely dangerous for black if he's not careful. It can also be extremely dangerous for white, though, at the same time. So that's the thing that makes it the most interesting, perhaps. So for example, in all the lines where he plays G4, like bishop E3, and now C5. And let's say knight E2, F6. And again, I think that black's already equalizing because I believe that the best move is to play E takes F6 and knight takes F6. But the thing is, if you try to play G4, here, then F takes E5. And then immediately, black will have the possibility to take here and just be completely winning. And so I think that black is just equalizing in these lines, unless I'm missing something, but I think he's doing just fine as of now. And anyways, I'll have to comment on A3, which I think is the main line. And now bishop takes C3 check. B takes C3, and I don't play D5. I play knight H5, again threatening queen H4 check. And the main move is knight H3. And one of white's main ideas is to try to prepare to play E4 quickly. So black plays F5. And he's still stopping E4. And there are a couple of moves here. There's G3, there's knight F2, and there's bishop G5. I think bishop G5 is actually the worst move, but it's the move played by Mamedyarov. So bishop G5, and I think queen E8 is good now. E3. But now just H6, bishop goes back, and E5. And there's already some pressure on the E file, you can sense. And let's say, hypothetically, if bishop F2, play D6. And it's hard to suggest something for white. His knight on H3 already looks a little bit pointless, so F3, F5, F4 is a threat. For example, bishop E2 and F4 already looks good for black. So anyways, if I go back, if knight F2, preparing E4, again, you can play C5, and it looks like it's much too risky to play E4 here. And so E3, knight C6. This is probably white's best line here. Bishop D3, B6, castle, and queen C7. And after bishop A6 and knight A5, black has very good chances to win that pawn. So it'll be a pretty complicated game after that. So anyways, winning the pawn isn't the end of the game, obviously. It usually becomes extremely complicated. But that line looks basically equal. So g3 was the toughest line for me to find equality in, actually. And I started off looking at b6, which I think is actually dubious. For example, if e4, bishop b7, take, and in a position like this, if white just plays something like rook a2 and brings the rook over, I think he's just slightly better here. He needs to find a more creative way to stop e4. For example, if you play take and queen e8, defending the h5 knight, again it becomes difficult. For example, here and e5 and queen c2, and it's not easy to find good squares for the knight. So I think that that black needs to play much more carefully. So I think knight f6 is definitely the best move here. And if knight f4, knight c6, if h4, then you can play d6, and on the next move you can play e5 and drive the knight away. So black should be totally fine there. So bishop g2, continuing to try to play e4, and now playing knight c6 I think looks good. And if castle, you can play knight a5, c5, and d6 strikes back at the center with equal game. And so if e4, which is the only challenging move, now you just take on e4 and play e5, and it appears to be equal. Take, e5. And then black simply develops after that, and all of the threats are gone. So I think that this line has been pretty much neutralized, basically completely. So I don't really know if there's anything else to say here. The only last thing I would say is that looking back at one of the lines like take, knight e2, f6, yeah, I mean, when you look at these lines like g4 and now take, check, and on the next move you can simply take here and win back the piece. So there doesn't really appear to be any challenging way to meet this setup. So I'm going to go on to g3 now. I think that was pretty brief, but it was enough to equalize. So g3, and now one of the main moves is to play a c5 setup, but I think it's very safe to just play castle, bishop g2, and d5. And now there are two main moves. There's knight f3 and there's a3. If a3, I simply take and take here. And I think that the main line is pretty much equalizing without any real sidelines, actually. Queen a4, and now it's like a Moran sort of thing with bishop d7, bishop c6, and knight bd7, knight b6, and bishop d5. And black has very firm control of the light squares on the queen side, so he seems to be doing just fine with no real threats. And so knight f3, and now I simply recommend just taking the pawn, d takes c4, and if a3, now you can simply take and play